We started Daniel. We looked at the first 4 chapters of Daniel. And then we looked at chapters 7 and 8 and the prophecies that were dealt with there. And as we're sticking with narrative, or trying to stick with the narrative, we did look at those prophecies and those visions just because of their New Testament significance, which is the kingdom of God, and how they are, we tried to look at how they're interwoven and very much connected. So Daniel chapter 2, which has that great prophecy that in the days of those kings, this is the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, in the days of those kings, God, the God of heaven, will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, is parallel with Daniel's vision in chapter 7, the vision of the 4 beasts. So the 4 kingdoms in chapter 2 are the same as the 4 kingdoms in chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, 2 of those 4 kingdoms are mentioned. So that vision is parallel as well, even though Babylonia and Rome are not a part of Daniel chapter 8. So that's why we looked at those. But staying chronologically with the chronology in view, we didn't look at chapters 5 and 6 yet because they happen after the visions and prophecies of Daniel 7, 8, 9, and I guess the following ones as well. So the chapters following 6, basically. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at Daniel 5 and Daniel 6, 2 very popular chapters, right up there with chapter 3, because chapter 3 is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 5 has to do with the handwriting on the wall, and chapter 6 has to do with the lion's den. So the narrative at chapter 5 sort of jumps forward, especially if you start at chapter 1 and go through 2, 3, 4. Chapter 5 really jumps ahead to a time when a man named Belshazzar is the king of this kingdom of Babylonia. And the events of this chapter are supposed to have happened on October 12th, 539 BC. That is the date of a Babylonian text that is presumably from Herodotus, the Greek historian. Take that or leave it as you please if that's the date. But what we do know is that these events of chapter 5 happen on the very night that Babylon fell. We know that. What day it was and what time frame is not certain, but we do know this was the very exact night that the Babylonians fell. Babylon will end, and the people that took them over begin in Daniel chapter 5. So, as we pointed out recently in our study of all the men and women of the Bible, when we looked at Belshazzar, this chapter was used for quite some time as supposed proof of the Bible's errancy. It's wrong. There's an error because they say that their archaeological discoveries confirm that the king when Babylon fell was Nabonidus, not Belshazzar. This thing here that looks like a weird corncob looking thing, it does to me anyway, is an ancient piece of writing, basically. The way they used to write, I'm glad that somebody invented paper and pages because that doesn't look very practical to me, much less the language that it's written in. But it's the Nabonidus Chronicle, it's called. So, once again, things discovered in the dirt over there that just perfectly corresponds with the biblical narrative. What we end up learning from this and other archaeological discoveries is who Belshazzar was. It's not an error, but apparently the king was Nabonidus, but he had to go away to sort of put out some fires, if you will, in parts of his kingdom. And he's put his son in charge while he was gone. And he was gone for quite some time, years, several years, according to some historians. And his son's name was Belshazzar. So this is why Daniel and other people will refer to him as King Belshazzar, because that is pretty much what he was. He wasn't the actual king, but he was acting king. He was on the throne while his father, in the royal city while his father was away. And that's what this time period here, that time period, is when Daniel chapter 5 happened. And there's a very helpful piece of information in the text itself that helps to support that and help us understand whenever he offers that whoever would interpret this handwriting will be made the third ruler in the kingdom. It might be easy to just read over that and not think anything of it, but if you stop and think, it's like, wait a minute, why the third? He didn't mention any second. We don't read about any, right-hand man or anything like that, so why did he say third? Well, if Belshazzar was second because his father was first, then it makes perfect sense why Belshazzar would offer somebody to be the third ruler, because he himself was the second ruler. So, might be worth putting a note there by the verse. I think it's in two different verses. One of them is verse 16, and the other one is 29. So, anyway, Belshazzar is, the scene here is the king, Belshazzar, the acting king, is making a big old feast, party. Big old party. They're having a grand old time over there. They're on top of the world, pretty much literally. Having a big party, drunken feast, vessels of gold and silver. Belshazzar has the idea, why don't we get all those gold and silver vessels that they took from that temple over there in Judea and bring them here so we can drink out of them? These vessels aren't good enough for our grand old time, so we need these. Let's go get those. And it says they got them. They drank wine, verse 4, praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, stone. And immediately, verse 5 says, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And then the king's color changed. As we might expect. His thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. That sounds pretty descriptive of somebody who is absolutely terrified. 4 different descriptive, in a book that is very scarce with details. That's a lot of details for one aspect of this. His color changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So he called for, I bet you can guess, the people that always help everything. They know everything. They solve everything. Here's another piece of stuff found in the dirt over there. That's Nabonidus. Can't you tell? Looks just like him. Who'd he call for? All those words that basically refer to the same people. Enchanters, Chaldeans, astrologers, wise men, probably throw in sorcerers, magicians in there. All of it is the same. They're all, as far as we're concerned, if they're not literally exactly the same, they're close enough. Same class of people. This is who they always call for, but he called for them loudly. And I don't think it was because he was drunk. When people are intoxicated, they generally get loud, more loud than normal. I think this volume was because of his fear, not because of his intoxication. Well, they come in. He says, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation, shall be clothed with purple and have a gold chain around his neck, shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So 3 different verses. I missed this one. 16, 29, and 7 at least. So maybe good to point out, like we did in our study of him a couple months ago, he did not see writing on the wall per se. He saw a hand that was writing on the wall. The hand too. He didn't just see writing show up. It says the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the wall. Yeah, that would... No wonder he was shaking in his sandals, you know. All the king's wise men came in. They couldn't read it or make known to the king the interpretation. King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. Here's another, just like verse 6. He was greatly alarmed. His color changed and his lords were perplexed. But then the queen mother, it seems, said, don't be alarmed. I know about this man, this guy. He helped King Nebuchadnezzar when he had a dream that alarmed him. He made him the chief of the magicians and enchanters and Chaldeans and astrologers. Guess what this man's name was? Daniel. Belteshazzar, his other name that Nebuchadnezzar gave him. So they said, get Daniel in here. Well, he gets Daniel in there. He says, you keep your rewards for yourself. I don't want any of your rewards. I don't want anything from you. But I'll read you the writing. Keep your rewards, but I'll read this to you, and I'll tell you what it means. So here's what he says it means. Won't even bother with the words, because I know I'll say them wrong, even though you probably won't be able to tell. But no, first, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. There's the first word, repeated once, so twice that word is said. The next word is, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. The third, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That's the interpretation of the words that were written on that wall. God is the one who did this, obviously. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. I doubt Belshazzar understood how literal that statement was. He's numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Now, tonight, today's the last day. He didn't realize that. He gave Daniel the reward, even though he didn't want it. Made him the third ruler in the kingdom. And verse 30 says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So what we've just read is, what Daniel just, I guess you could call it a prophecy, what Daniel just said happened right then. How long was it before he said that? Between when he said this and when it happened? I don't know. Long enough for him to be given these rewards and named the third ruler. But at some point that very night, here come the Medes and the Persians. Darius the Mede received the kingdom. And there's good reason to believe that that language indicates that whoever Darius the Mede was, he wasn't the king at that time. He wasn't on top, but he was a servant of the king. He may have been one of the king's generals. It is generally believed that the king at this time was a man named Cyrus, and that Darius was one of his generals or some other leader, and that he was in charge of the royal city of Babylon while, until the king could get there, that kind of thing. He's to maintain it until the king gets there. That's why it says he received the kingdom. If he got it from the Chaldeans, then he hardly received it. I mean, he took it, but it says he received it, and it's believed that that is a reference to from somebody that was superior to himself. So at this point, the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that is, the new Babylonian Empire, is gone. And it's never come back. Now it's the Medo-Persian Empire, which is also called sometimes the Achaemenid Empire. That's sometimes what it'll be referred to as in the inscriptions and therefore in other literature if you read about this time period. But we generally refer to it as the Medo-Persian Empire. It's the Medes and the Persians. And it was this big yellow stuff. It's the biggest one we've seen so far in all biblical history. This is the biggest empire that the world has ever known at this point in history. The Medo-Persian Empire. It spans, this is Egypt down here. There's Jerusalem. There's the royal city of Babylon. There's the royal city of Susa, which was the capital for the Persians when they are in charge, which right now the Medes are more on top. If you remember, we looked at that prophecy of Daniel. That ram had two horns and one of them was higher than the other, but then the other one ended up being higher than that one. Well, at first, the highest one was the Medes and Persians, but then the Persians got more power, and so then this was the Medes and the Persians. And so early on, it's called the Medes and the Persians, but then by the time of the book of Esther, they're called the Persians and the Medes. And that's not a coincidence. There's a reason for that. That's because at that time, the Persians were more in power. And then before too long, it was just Persians. The Medes weren't even mentioned in it, just the Persians. So in chapter 6, during Darius' reign over this city and whatnot, he appointed people, like always, government officials. And over these officials, he appointed 3 high officials. And guess who one of them was? Daniel. Man, he's just getting lucky breaks, isn't he? No matter who's in charge, he's always noticed. And he's always rising up. Well, I think that's because God clearly is working behind the scenes, just like in Joseph's life, he was in Daniel's life. Well, it says Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. The king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So more things are in store for Daniel. Well, guess what usually happens, or maybe not usually, but many times, when something like what we just read in verse 3 happens. 3 high officials, Daniel became distinguished above all the other ones. Jealousy.
Was it also because he was a Jew?
Maybe. Well, not because he was a Jew, probably, but just because he was not one of them. Which we don't know who the other high officials were. They may have been foreigners as well, as far as the Medes and Persians were concerned. But he was different than they were. And they bring that up. Whatever they were, they're going to bring that up. They clearly weren't Jews, Hebrews, because they brought up the law of his God. So whatever they were, they knew Daniel was not one of them. But I think it was mainly because they didn't like him. And they didn't like him because he was better than they were. Not because he thought that he was better than they were, because he was better than they were. So Daniel is rising up, and here's what we read. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they couldn't find any ground. They found nothing. They didn't find any fault. Why? Because of according to the text? Okay. Okay. Keep going. Or actually, maybe back up, depending on which part you just read from. Maybe the ESV reads differently. But it is on the screen. See every head go in unison. Huh? ESV says they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. Faithful in what? Faithful in regard to the kingdom, it sounds like to me. but he was also, we know he was also faithful to God, but I don't think that's what it means in this context. He was faithful. He obeyed. He submitted. No error or fault was found in him. That is saying a lot. When people start to try to dig up dirt and they still can't find anything, that is impressive. It takes a very spotless record for this to be the case. And yet, that was the case. So these men gave him the biggest compliment anybody could ever be given. They weren't meaning it as a compliment. But they said, we're not going to find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. You know what they just said? The only way we're going to get this guy to break the law is if we put the law at odds with the law of his God. In other words, we know that he is so true to his God that he will break the law of the king if it conflicts with the law of his God. That's what they just said. That's the only way we're going to get any ground for complaint against Daniel, is if we make the law of the king contradict the law of his God, because we know that he will go side with the law of his God. And you know what? They were right. So here's what they did. They tricked the king. They deceived him and catered to his, at least the potential for his ego to take over, which, let's be honest, regardless of who King Darius was, who this Darius was, usually for a king, it's not that hard to get them to trip over their own ego. So what they said was, "Oh, glorious king, live forever." That wonderful way to greet a king. "Oh, King Darius, live forever." So they came up with this idea. We need to put this doctrine in place, this ordinance that says that for this period of time, 30 days, nobody can make any petition to God or man except to you, O king. And if they do, they'll be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. That is a terrible, terrible, terrible system of law right there. The law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. What kind of crazy law? And this was perfect harmony with Esther. Remember in Esther, not to get ahead of ourselves, but Haman had put that thing in order that all the Jews were going to be killed on that one day. Well, whenever they found out his trick, the king didn't say, you are not to do that on that day, because he couldn't. Why couldn't he? Because of this garbage. Can't be changed. So what he did is said, he gave another law that said the Jews can protect themselves, defend themselves when that day comes. I guess that's sort of a thanks. I would rather you just tell them not to do it, but, why can't you just make a new law that says they can't do it? Well, because for some reason, they thought this was a good idea to make the law unchangeable. So all they had to do was get him to sign it, and it's done. Even if he regrets it. Too bad. Done. And that's what ended up happening. He did not see through this shroud of deceit. And verse 10 says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, what did he do?
He opened the windows and stood in front of them. Kneeled in front of them to pray.
He went, says the same thing, doesn't it? He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So you could pretty much cut out all the middle part of that verse and it still says the same thing. When Daniel knew the document had been signed, he went and did as he had done previously. He didn't change a single thing. Isn't that exactly what they knew that he would do? That's what they said. If we make the laws contradict one another, he's still going to do what his God wants. So we got him. The thing is, they didn't get him. He didn't care. They didn't trick him. He knew. It says when he knew that the document had been signed, he didn't change anything. Yes?
Well, but Daniel still could have prayed to his God 3 times a day and had the windows closed. It was an in-your-face deal.
Yeah.
He knew what they had planned, and he thought,
Well, he usually did it with the windows open, apparently, so he didn't even change that. And you know what the thing is? unless I'm totally mistaken here and I'm forgetting myself, I don't know if there is anywhere strictly in the law of Moses that says they have to pray 3 times a day. So it's not even that the law said it, but this was an additional thing that he did out of the devotion and love in his heart for Jehovah. In addition to the law, there was no legal obligation as far as the law of Moses was concerned to do that, and he still didn't even change that.
Because he wasn't ashamed and he feared God more than he feared.
Yeah, he was not going to give in to that kind of trickery and degrade his own faith and devotion just because of the peril that it might cause to himself. Even when he knew the document had been signed. Almost anybody else in Daniel's position would justify not doing it. It's just 30 days, isn't it? Surely God will understand if for 30 days I don't pray 3 times a day, or at all, or at least close the windows. But he didn't change anything from his normal everyday routine. Yeah, Joe?
Is the concept that he prayed toward Jerusalem also an indication that he revered the politics of Israel?
I think it was the temple. I think it was related to the temple.
That's what Solomon said.
Yeah, it was a common practice apparently for them to pray toward, he said, whenever your people pray towards this house, hear them from heaven and answer. So I think it was a general custom and principle and practice of the Jews to pray if they were not in Jerusalem, or I guess even if they were in Jerusalem, wherever you are, unless you're at the temple, you're going to pray towards the temple. And I think the Muslims do the same thing with Mecca, and they would have gotten that from the Jews, if I may say.
Obviously prayed aloud too, or they wouldn't have known that he was actually making supplications
Yeah.
to the Lord his house.
Apparently, yeah, because like you said, how else would they know unless they, somehow eavesdropped or something and not that he was yelling out the window, but enough for them to hear him. If he was praying inside, unless they were spying on him, they wouldn't have known. But they did know. So it says they came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. And that's what how did they see him or did they hear him? We don't know, but they knew he was doing it. So then they went to the king.
Well, they did know that he was one of the exiles from Judah.
Yeah.
So I think they did know religiously that he was different, that they were different.
Yeah, they had funny practices, I guess, as far as they were concerned, because they weren't what he was. So they knew they could get him this way because he was so true to his God, which would kind of imply that they weren't very true to their own gods, which, what difference does that make because they weren't gods anyway?
But that's what he did when he was taken. I wasn't here last week, but obviously Daniel refused to eat the food
Yeah.
that they offered. Daniel has
He didn't even want to risk defiling himself with the food and drink. So now, this is even more impressive than that, in my opinion, just because no obligation. The law doesn't say to do this. So the compliment they gave him in verse 5, he proved it to be, he was even more virtuous and honorable than even that compliment, because even an optional, additional thing, he still didn't change. Even though, like I said, anybody else in his position, or most people would have justified that it's not worth dying just to do this. But he said, it is, if that's what God wills. So they go to Darius, and they say, hey, king, didn't you sign an injunction that anybody who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you will be cast into the den of lions? He said, yes, you know I did. It stands fast, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. And they said, well, guess what? Daniel, one of those exiles from Judah, he pays no attention to you, O king. There they are, stroking his ego again. He's ignoring you, O king. Very, very slick. Daniel had no ill will towards the king, and he was faithful to the king as far as that went. It said so in verse 4. He pays no attention to you. or to the injunction that you have signed. But he still makes his petition 3 times a day to his God, is the implication. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed. How come? Because he couldn't believe that Daniel would be such a little whippersnapper to do that? He was distressed because now he has realized the trap that he fell into. He set his mind to deliver Daniel. Now, I don't know much about this Darius. I don't know. I may have the tendency maybe to give him too much credit. I don't know what exactly this conclusions we can draw about him from this, but as far as I see it, there are only 2 options. It either says something about his character because of how much he loved right, and he knew that this wasn't right, or it says something about how much he thought of Daniel. It has to be one of those 2, because otherwise he would not have cared. He would have been like, well, I signed the law, can't be changed. I wish I hadn't, but oh well, got to do it because the law says. And I signed it myself. I fell into the trap. But it says he set his mind to deliver Daniel. He's going to try to find a way to make it so that Daniel doesn't have to go in that lion's den. It says he labored until the sun went down. What time was it when they told him? Don't know. But the implication is that all day he tried. So,
I have a question though. If it's not in the king's power to change the laws can't be changed thing, then who would ever have the power? It seems like that if anybody could, that would be the king that would be able to say, actually, I don't like that law. So,
well, then they would have to write another law that just like the example I used from Esther, he couldn't write a law that said the other law is canceled. Nobody. The law, they almost had the right idea. The law should be above everybody, including the king. But the fact that a law can't be changed, that obviously is too far, because then it's like, then all these traps can happen. So what Xerxes did in Esther was he wrote a law that said the Jews can defend themselves when the people that Haman summoned come to attack them, because he couldn't write a law that said nobody is to attack the Jews on this day, because that law, he couldn't cancel that, but he could write another law. I'm not trying to say it makes sense, but that's the emphasis here multiple times. It cannot be revoked. So in other words, the king can't say, no, I don't want to throw Daniel in there. Yeah, that's what the law says, but I don't care. I don't want to throw him in there. And he couldn't even say, no, he shouldn't be thrown in there because this was a trick. The king shouldn't just be able to say no because I don't want him to be thrown in there. Even if he did break the law, that would have been okay, but he knew that this was a trap and a trick because they wanted Daniel to die. But he still signed the law and it can't be revoked. So he labored until the sun went down to rescue Daniel. And that's honorable even if he was selfishly motivated, as far as I'm concerned. Even if it was selfishly motivated, the fact that he set his mind to it and labored until the sun went down to deliver Daniel still is an honorable thing, because he knew that Daniel didn't deserve that at the end of the day. So these men came by agreement and said, let us remind you, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians can't be changed. He knew that his hands were tied, so to speak. There was nothing he could do. So he had to carry it out. And he brought Daniel, cast him into the lion's den, but he said, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. Stone was brought, laid on the mouth of the den. King sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. That's a very good verse to help us understand what they did to Jesus' tomb. Put the stone on it. They sealed it this is most likely the same kind of sealing they did. They didn't seal it so that it couldn't be open. They sealed it so it couldn't be open without somebody knowing that it was. Just like a tamper-proof seal on a product. Or, you know, you got something in a jar and it's got the little pop button on the top, and you know if that button is down, that you know it hadn't been tampered with. And it says if that button is up, you don't want to consume that because it could be contaminated or something. They sealed it so that nobody could open it without somebody knowing that it had been opened. And if you break that seal, then you're in big trouble. So Daniel 6:17, I've got a note, Matthew 27:66. So the king was not done with his resolve about Daniel. There was nothing more he could do except some things that he thought of that he could do. And it says he went to his palace and spent the night fasting. He would not be bothered by anybody, and he couldn't sleep. Clearly, he was disturbed by this. For whatever reason, this is not the description of a man who says, well, nothing more I can do. You know, I really hate it, but what can I do? He was very disturbed by this. And maybe it was because he felt that Daniel would help him a lot, so it was selfishly motivated, or maybe he just knew that Daniel was innocent. Either way, he was very bothered by this. At the break of day, he got up and he ran to the lion's den. And he yelled out in a tone of anguish, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually," there's that phrase again, "been able to deliver you from the lions?" I wonder how hopeless he felt at that moment. Like, what am I doing? There's not going to be an answer. Nobody's going to answer me. There's no telling what is in there if we looked. But somebody answered. Daniel said, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." And the king was exceedingly glad. And he commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. Guess what? He could do that because the law didn't say he had to stay down there. He did what the law said, didn't he? He was cast in the lion's den. He wasn't just cast in there. He stayed in there all night. And by the way, just based on history and general understanding, these kinds of dens, these lions would be starved. Because the more starved they are, the more vicious they're going to be, and the more brutal they're going to be to any meat of any kind that is thrown in there. So they would most likely, and the same thing they do with dogs, people who want their dogs to be like that, or dog fighting, things like that. So the fact that these lions did not bother Daniel, even though they were starved, is, I won't say it's a miracle, but it's pretty close. It is extremely unusual. It says, he was taken up out of the den, no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God.
He said that God closed their mouth, so it was miraculous.
Well, I mean,
God closed the lion's mouth so they couldn't harm him.
yeah, but not necessarily in a miraculous way. It could have been providential. I mean, Daniel was thrown in there, and the lions just didn't do anything to him. So it's sort of like,
Did you read on where what they threw the men in there and their children and wives? And what
yeah,
they did to them?
yeah.
Sent an angel to close.
Yeah, he said God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, which, again, he's just saying, God saved me. And it's the way God saved him is because the angels didn't, the lions didn't hurt him when he was in there. It's a little bit less obvious than the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into fire and their clothes weren't burned or anything. That is an obvious miracle because people can't be standing in fire and not get hurt. But in this case, the lions just didn't.
In that same case, he sent the angel to protect them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Very similar to when
I think so.
I mean, the angels actually do play a part.
Yeah, they can play a part, just like God can play a part.
It's not necessarily, it's not miraculous. It's just
Yeah, in this case, unless I'm missing it, the angel doesn't, Darius doesn't see the angel. He did see the angel in the fire. But in this case, he doesn't see anybody else. The only reason that God or the angel is mentioned is because Daniel says, God is responsible for these lions not eating me. That's basically what he means by he shut the lions' mouths. It doesn't mean he literally shut their mouths like they were trying to eat him, but they couldn't because God taped their mouths shut. But he made them not eat me. They haven't harmed me. They weren't interested in me is what is the idea. And as unusual as that was, it doesn't exactly fit the description of a miracle. But
I'm not sure why that would be an issue.
I don't think it
It
is.
seems very parallel to the previous incident in the saying that God intervened.
Yeah,
Daniel knew it because the thing had been sealed, so they couldn't see it until after the fact.
yeah,
And obviously, when others were thrown in, that didn't happen.
yeah. I'm not saying I don't think it's an issue. I was just pointing out that this is yet another instance where God intervenes by not performing a miracle, because the only thing that happened is the lions did not eat Daniel. I mean, and that it is a big deal. But my point is, God does lots of things that are a big deal that are not miraculous.
Well,
And
how many times would we be confronted in a lion's den and be able to get out of it?
very, very, very few.
Because the lions obviously would have been hungry, they would have made sure they were hungry.
Yeah, that's what I said.
So to me, that kind of has to be miraculous. I mean,
Well, no, I mean, it's not a miracle when the lion kills the man of God who leaves the house. But God made that lion kill that man.
well, they were acting abnormal for their state, is what I'm saying.
And so that lion was acting abnormal for his state. He ate. Well, you can disagree, but if a lion not eating somebody is not a miracle. So you can disagree all you want. But all that happened on this occasion was the lions did not eat him. So as unusual as that is, there's nothing miraculous about a lion not eating somebody. I know. Yeah. God does things all the time.
And it was direct.
God directly does things all the time. Just like He directly made those 2 she-bears kill all those young thugs. No miracle there. He made a lion kill the man of God who disobeyed Him. Wasn't a miracle there. If a law of nature is not broken, then there's no miracle performed.